the rain had been falling over Thornwell Hollow for 3 days when the letter arrived, and Eleanor Vance knew, the moment the postman handed it to her through the half-open door of the little flower shop she rented above the bakery, that her quiet life was about to end. The envelope was heavy, the colour of old cream, and the wax seal pressed into its flap bore a crest she had not seen since she was a child, a hawthorn branch crossed with a single key. She turned it over twice in her chilled fingers, watching the rain streak the window glass behind her, and she felt the small hairs rise along the back of her neck as though some long, shut door, somewhere far off and forgotten, had just swung open on its hinges. She did not open it at once. She set it on the counter beside the buckets of white roses and waited until the shop bell had stopped its trembling, until the postman's footsteps had faded into the wet street, and only then, when she was alone again with the smell of cut stems and damp paper, did she break the seal. The handwriting inside belonged to a lawyer's clerk, neat and impersonal, but the words it carried struck her like a stone dropped into still water. Her great-aunt Margaret, whom she had not laid eyes upon in 19 years, had died at the age of 91 in the upstairs bedroom of Hartwood Hall, and she, Eleanor Vance, was named the sole heir of the estate. There was a sum of money, modest but real. There was the manor house itself, with its 40 rooms and its overgrown gardens, and its 100 acres of woodland sloping down to a lake nobody had swum in for half a century. And there was a single line near the bottom that the clerk had clearly copied directly from the will, for it carried a different cadence than the rest. An old woman's voice, reaching across the silence of death. To my grandniece Eleanor, who alone among them never once asked me for anything, I leave the whole of Hartwood, and the truth that sleeps beneath its floors. Eleanor read that line 4 times. Then she folded the letter, pressed it flat against her chest, and stood for a long while listening to the rain, trying to remember the face of a woman she had met exactly once, on a summer afternoon when she was 9 years old and had been brought to the great house in her best dress and told to be quiet, to be good, to not touch anything. She remembered very little. A long hall lined with portraits whose eyes seemed to follow her. A piano nobody played, and an old woman in a high-backed chair by a tall window who had looked at her for a long time without speaking and then said, in a voice like dry leaves, "You have your grandmother's eyes. Be careful with them. They see too much." Eleanor had not understood then what the words meant. She was not certain she understood them now, but she packed a single suitcase that very night, gave notice on the flower shop to the baker downstairs who had always been kind to her, and 3 days later, with the last of her savings and a borrowed car that smelled of someone else's cigarettes, she drove north out of the city and into the green, folded hills where Hartwood waited for her like a held breath. The road narrowed as she climbed. The towns grew smaller and farther apart, then vanished altogether, until there was only the forest pressing close on either side, and the occasional iron gate marking the entrance to some estate hidden among the trees. She nearly missed the turning for Hartwood. The sign had fallen and lay half buried in nettles, but the gateposts still stood. 2 pillars of weathered stone topped with stone hawthorn finials gone green with moss, and between them a long drive of pale gravel curved away beneath an avenue of ancient lime trees whose branches met overhead to form a tunnel of dim and trembling light. She turned in. The gravel crunched beneath her tires. And then, as the drive completed its long, slow curve, the house revealed itself all at once, and Eleanor brought the car to a stop in the middle of the avenue and simply stared. Hartwood Hall was larger than she had remembered, and stranger. It rose 3 stories of grey stone against a sky the colour of wet slate, its many windows dark and watchful. its roofline a complicated geography of gables and chimneys, and a single square tower at the eastern end. Ivy had claimed the whole of the western wing, climbing to the very gutters, and the gardens that had once spread in formal terraces below the front terrace had run wild, the box hedges grown shaggy and shapeless, the gravel paths nearly swallowed by grass. And yet, for all its neglect, there was something proud in the way the house stood, something unbroken, as though it had simply folded its arms and waited out the years, certain that someone would come at last to wake it. Someone had. Eleanor drove the last 100 yards slowly and parked before the great front steps, and when she climbed out of the car, the silence that met her was so deep and so total that she could hear her own heart. No birdsong. No wind, only the soft tick of the cooling engine, and very faintly, from somewhere far below the house, the whisper of water moving over stone. She climbed the steps. The front door was oak, 10 feet tall, studded with iron, and from a great rusted ring hung a key she did not need, for the door stood already an inch ajar. She stopped. Her hand went out, hesitated, and then she pushed, and the door swung inward on hinges that did not so much as creak, as though they had been oiled, recently, by careful hands. The entrance hall opened before her, vast and shadowed, its floor a chessboard of black and white marble, its ceiling lost in darkness 2 stories above. A staircase of dark wood rose at the far end and divided, sweeping up to a gallery that ran around all 4 sides. And everywhere, on every wall, hung the portraits she half remembered, generations of heartwood faces looking down at her out of their gilded frames, with expressions ranging from severity to sorrow. The air smelled of beeswax and cold ash, and beneath that, something older, something like the inside of a closed book. "Hello," she called, and her voice fell flat and small into all that space. "Hello, is anyone here?" Nothing answered. She stepped fully inside, and the door swung shut behind her of its own slow weight, and the latch fell with a sound like a full stop at the end of a sentence. It was then, in the new and absolute silence, that she heard the footsteps. They came from somewhere above and to the left, unhurried, deliberate, the measured tread of a man crossing a wooden floor, and Eleanor stood frozen in the centre of that great marble hall, with her heart climbing into her throat as the footsteps reached the gallery, and a figure appeared at the rail and looked down at her. He was tall and dressed in dark clothes, well made but not new, the clothes of a man who took care of few things but took care of those well. His hair was black, going to iron at the temples, and his face, even at that distance, even in that poor light, was a face she would not soon forget, not handsome in any easy way, but carved and certain, with a strong jaw and a high brow and eyes that, when they found hers, seemed to take her measure in a single sweep and find the answer already known. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then the man said, in a low voice that carried easily down through the cold air, "You must be Eleanor. We have been expecting you." "We," she thought. "We." But she said only, "And you are." He came down the staircase then, one hand trailing the banister, and he did not hurry, and she had the strange impression that he had descended these same stairs 10,000 times, that he knew the precise height of every tread without looking. When he reached the bottom, he stopped a careful distance from her, and up close he was younger than she had first thought, perhaps 40. Perhaps a little less, and there was a tiredness in him that had nothing to do with the hour. "My name is Adrian Hale," he said. "I was your great-aunt's steward for the last 11 years. I managed the estate, what was left of it, and I cared for her at the end." He paused. She left instructions that I was to remain until you came, and explain to you what you have inherited. I am sorry for your loss, he added, though his voice did not sound sorry so much as careful, and Eleanor understood at once that there were a great many things this man was not saying, and that he intended to go on not saying them for as long as he possibly could. Thank you, she said. Though I hardly knew her. I met her once, when I was a child. I am aware, Adrian Hale said. She spoke of it. He turned then and gestured toward a doorway off the hall, beyond which firelight flickered warm and gold. There is a fire in the morning room, and tea if you would like it. You have had a long drive. And then, we should talk, Miss Vance, because there are things about this house that you will want to understand before nightfall. Before nightfall. The words sat oddly in the air. Eleanor looked at him, at his careful face, at the way he stood with his hands loose at his sides as though prepared, always, for something, and she felt the first true stirring of unease move through her, cold as the draught beneath the great front door. But she was tired and chilled, and the firelight was warm, and so she followed him, the heels of her shoes ringing out across the marble into the heart of a house that had waited 19 years for her to come home, and which had, she would learn, no intention of letting her leave the same woman she had been when she arrived. The morning room was smaller than the hall, and warmer, with walls of faded green silk and a fire crackling in a marble hearth. A tea tray waited on a low table, the silver polished, the porcelain thin enough to see the firelight through. He had set out 2 cups. He had been certain she would come, then, and certain, too, that she would stay long enough to drink tea. Eleanor sat in the chair he indicated and watched him pour, his movements economical and exact, and she thought that whatever else Adrian Hale was, he was a man who had learned to make himself useful in small, precise ways, the way a person does when their position depends on never being a burden. "Milk?" he asked. "No," she said. "Thank you." He handed her the cup and took the chair opposite, and for a moment they sat in silence while the fire spat and the rain returned, soft against the tall windows. Then, he said, "How much did the lawyers tell you?" "Very little," she said. "That she had died. That she left me the house. There was a line in the will. About a truth beneath the floors." He went very still. It was a small thing, almost nothing, the briefest pause in the act of lifting his own cup, but Eleanor saw it, because she had spent her whole life watching people, learning to read the small, involuntary truths that bodies tell when mouths are busy lying. He set the cup down without drinking. "She wrote that," he said, "in her own hand. I argued against it." He looked at her then, fully, for the first time, and his eyes were grey. The grey of the slate roof, the grey of the sky outside. "Your great-aunt believed that this house keeps secrets, Miss Vance, and she believed that you, of all her relations, were the one meant to find them. I told her it was cruelty to send you here knowing what you might dig up. She told me it was the only honest thing left to do." He spread his hands. "So here we are." Eleanor's heart was beating very hard. "What secrets?" she said. He did not answer at once. Instead, he rose and crossed to the tall window and stood looking out at the ruined gardens and the grey lake far below. And when he spoke, his voice had changed, gone quieter, gone inward. 60 years ago, he said, there was another woman in this house. Your great-aunt's younger sister. Her name was Clara, and she was 19, and one autumn she vanished from Hartwood and was never seen again. The family said she had run off to marry a man they disapproved of. The police, what police there were in those days, in this remote place, made a few inquiries and went away. And the house closed over the empty space where she had been, the way water closes over a stone, and within a few years it was as though Clara Hartwood had never existed at all. He turned from the window. But your great-aunt never believed it. She spent 60 years in this house, Miss Vance, growing old alone, refusing every offer to sell, refusing to leave, because she was certain to the very end, that her sister had never left Hartwood at all, that something had happened to her here, and that the truth of it was still here, somewhere, waiting. Eleanor set down her own cup, because her hand had begun, very slightly, to shake. "And the line in the will," she said, "the truth that sleeps beneath the floors." "Yes," Adrian Hale said. The fire cracked. Outside the rain came harder. "I do not know what she meant by it precisely," he went on. "She would not tell me, at the end. She said only that she had found something. In her last year, something she had searched for her whole life. And that she had not the strength left to do what needed doing, and that you must do it." He looked at her, and for the first time there was something in his careful face that was not careful at all. Something raw and almost pleading. "I tried to talk her out of it," he said again, quietly. "You should know that. I did not want you brought into this. But she was a stubborn woman, your great-aunt, the most stubborn I have ever known. And she has reached out of her grave to set a task before you, and I do not think, Miss Vance, that this house will let you go until it is done." Eleanor sat very still in the firelit room, in the great cold house, with the rain falling and the portraits watching from the hall beyond, and a stranger standing at the window telling her impossible things. And she understood, with a clarity that frightened her, that she believed every word he had said. She had felt it the moment she crossed the threshold. The house was holding its breath, and it was waiting for her to begin. She slept that first night in a guest room Adrian had prepared, a high-ceilinged chamber with a 4-poster bed and heavy curtains and a fire he had laid himself. And she slept badly, waking again and again to the unfamiliar sounds of the old house settling around her, the creak of timbers, the sigh of wind in the chimney, and once, near 3 in the morning, a sound she could not explain at all. A faint and rhythmic knocking that seemed to come from very far below, from beneath the very foundations of the house. 3 slow knocks, and then silence. 3 slow knocks, and then silence, until she pressed her hands over her ears and told herself it was the water she had heard, the underground stream Adrian had mentioned, the spring that fed the lake. Nothing more, and at last she slept. In the morning the rain had stopped, pale sun came through the curtains, and the house, which had seemed so menacing in the dark, looked merely old and sad and beautiful in the light, and Eleanor dressed and went down and found Adrian in the kitchen, a vast flagstoned room with a range that he had somehow coaxed into life, and there was coffee and bread he had baked himself, and for a little while eating breakfast at the scrubbed deal table with the morning light slanting in. She could almost believe that everything he had told her the night before had been a kind of dream. But then he set down his cup and said, "I want to show you something," and the dream was over. He led her up the great staircase and along the gallery and into the east wing, through rooms shrouded in dust sheets, past furniture that loomed like sleeping animals beneath their white shrouds, until they came to a door at the very end of a long corridor, a plain door, locked, and from his pocket Adrian took a ring of keys and found the right one and turned it, and the door opened onto a small square room flooded with light from a single tall window, and Eleanor stopped on the threshold and caught her breath. The room was a study, and it was the study of an obsession. Every wall was covered. Maps of the estate, hand-drawn, annotated in a spidery hand. photographs, brown and faded, of the house, the gardens, the lake, the woods, pinned in clusters and connected by lengths of red thread. Newspaper clippings yellow with age. And everywhere, on the maps, on the photographs, on the very walls themselves, a single mark recurred, a small, careful cross in red ink. Dozens of them, scattered across the geography of Heartwood like a constellation of wounds. This was her room, Adrian said quietly from behind her. Margaret's. She spent the last 20 years of her life in here. Mostly, I would bring her meals and find her standing just where you are standing, looking at it all, as though if she only stared hard enough the answer would rise up out of the walls. Eleanor stepped inside. On the desk beneath the window lay an open notebook, the last of many she saw, for a whole shelf of them stood behind, identical, numbered, the diary of 60 years of searching. The open notebook was filled with the same spidery hand, and the final entry, dated only weeks before, was short. She read it aloud, softly, into the still bright air. I am close now, closer than I have ever been. The water knows. The water has always known. When the girl comes, tell her to follow the water down. Eleanor looked up. Follow the water down, she repeated. What does it mean? I have wondered that for weeks, Adrian said. There is the stream, of course. It rises from a spring somewhere beneath the eastern part of the house and runs down through the cellars and out below the old terrace and so down to the lake. You can hear it, at night, if the house is quiet. She nodded slowly. She had heard it. She had heard, she thought, more than that. But she said nothing of the knocking, not yet, because it sounded mad even in her own head. And she did not yet know this man well enough to hand him her madness. Instead, she crossed to the wall and studied the maps, the red crosses, and she saw now that they were not scattered at random at all. That they clustered, that they grew denser as the geography moved eastward and downward, toward the tower, toward the cellars, toward the place where the water rose. May I, she said, gesturing at the notebooks, and Adrian inclined his head, and she took down the first of them, the earliest, and opened it, and began to read. And that was how the long, strange days of that first week passed, with Eleanor in the dead woman's study, reading her way through 60 years of grief and obsession, while Adrian moved through the house below, mending what could be mended. And twice a day they met at the kitchen table and ate together and spoke, carefully at first, and then less carefully, of the puzzle that bound them. For it bound them. She felt that from the start. Whatever Adrian Hale was holding back, and he was holding much back, she was certain of it, they were on the same side of this thing, the two of them. The only two living souls in all that house of the dead, and a strange companionship grew up between them in those days, born of shared isolation and shared purpose. The kind of closeness that comes quickly when two people are thrown together at the edge of something vast and frightening. She learned things about him, slowly, that he had come to Heartwood 11 years before, a younger man then, running from something he would not name, and that Margaret had taken him in when he had nowhere else to go, and given him work and a roof and, in her severe and undemonstrative way, a kind of love, so that he had stayed long after any sensible man would have gone, stayed to care for her through her last failing years, stayed to bury her, stayed even now. She learned that he read, deeply and widely, and that there was a music in him he kept locked away, for once she came upon him at the old piano in the long gallery, the one nobody played. And he was playing it, softly. Something slow and aching and full of longing, and he stopped the instant he saw her and would not meet her eyes for the rest of that evening. And she learned, watching him, what she had already half known from the first hour, that she was not indifferent to him, that his careful gravity moved her, that when his grey eyes found hers across the kitchen table, she felt something turn over in her chest, slow and warm and frightening, a thing she had thought long dead in her. Killed years before by a marriage that had ended in cruelty, and a divorce that had left her hollowed out and wary of every man alive. She had come to Heartwood expecting to be alone. She had not expected him. And he, for his part, watched her too, she knew, with those grave grey eyes, and there was a hunger in his watching that he kept on a tight rein. And a sorrow, too, as though he had decided long ago that he was a man not permitted to want things, and was finding, to his own dismay, that he wanted her. They did not speak of it. There was no room yet for speaking of it, with the dead woman's task between them and the house holding its breath around them. But it was there, in the lengthening silences, in the way he poured her coffee just as she liked it without asking, in the way she found reasons to seek him out, and it grew, quietly, the way the ivy grew on the western wall, patient and certain, while above them in the bright study the red crosses waited, and the notebooks gave up their secrets, one terrible page at a time. It was in the 4th notebook that Eleanor found the photograph. It had been tucked between 2 pages, and it slid out into her lap as she turned them, a small square print, the corners soft with handling, and she picked it up and turned it to the light and felt the breath go out of her. It was a photograph of 2 young women, sisters plainly, standing arm in arm before the front steps of Heartwood in clothes of 60 years before, both of them laughing at something beyond the camera, both of them young and alive and luminous with it. And one of them, the younger, the one whose head was tipped back in laughter, the one who could only be Clara, had Eleanor's own face. Not similar, not alike. The same. The same eyes, the same brow, the same particular curve of the mouth caught mid-laugh, so that Eleanor sat in the dead woman's chair holding a photograph of a girl who had vanished 60 years before and stared into her own face staring back at her across all that gulf of time. Her hands were trembling. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in Margaret's spidery hand, were written 4 words. She has come back. Eleanor did not show Adrian the photograph. She could not have said why, except that it frightened her too deeply, and that some instinct told her to hold it close, to understand it herself before she let another soul see it. But it changed everything. The old woman's words took on a new and terrible weight. You have your grandmother's eyes. They see too much. She has come back. The line in the will. To my grandniece Eleanor, who alone among them never once asked me for anything. Had Margaret chosen her for the inheritance not because she was deserving, but because she wore a dead girl's face? Had she been summoned to Heartwood not as an heir, but as a kind of key shaped 60 years ahead of time, to fit a lock only she could open? Eleanor lay awake that night turning it over and over, and again, near 3, the knocking came. 3 slow knocks from far below and then silence, and this time she did not cover her ears. This time she rose and pulled a robe about her and took a candle, because the electric lights did not reach the lower parts of the house, and she went out into the dark corridor to find the source of it at last. The house at night was a different country. The shadows were deeper, the silences longer, and her single candle threw great lurching shapes across the walls as she made her way along the gallery and down the great stair and across the chessboard hall, following the sound, which grew no louder as she descended, but somehow clearer, more insistent. 3 knocks and silence. 3 knocks and silence, drawing her on toward the eastern end of the house, toward a low door beneath the stairs that she had not noticed before. A door that stood, like the front door on the day she came, already an inch ajar. Cold air breathed up from beyond it, damp and mineral, the breath of the earth. And from down there, below, in the dark, the water was running, and the knocking went on. Eleanor put her hand to the door, and a voice behind her said, very quietly, "Don't." She spun, the candle guttering, and Adrian was there, fully dressed though it was the middle of the night, as though he too did not sleep in this house, and his face in the candlelight was pale and strained. "Don't go down there alone," he said. "Not at night. Not ever, if I can help it." She stared at him, her heart pounding. "You hear it too," she said. It was not a question. The knocking. Every night. The slow exhalation of breath. "Yes," he said. 11 years I have heard it. And in 11 years I have gone down those stairs exactly once, the night your great-aunt died, because she asked me to, because she said she had found the place at last and wanted me to see." He stopped. His jaw worked. "And what did you see?" Eleanor whispered. Adrian Hale looked at her for a long moment in the wavering light, and then he said, "I think you had better let me show you in daylight. Some things should not be met in the dark." He reached past her gently and drew the low door shut, and the knocking, impossibly, stopped at once, as though whatever made it had been waiting only to be acknowledged, and then was content. "Come away," he said. And she went with him, back up through the sleeping house, and at the door of her room he paused. And for a moment in the candlelight, the careful distance between them thinned almost to nothing, and she thought he might say something, might reach for her, and she found that she wanted him to. But he only said, "Good night, Eleanor," the first time he had used her name without the miss before it, and the sound of it in his low voice stayed with her long after his footsteps had faded, long into the small hours, until at last, with the candle burned to a stub and the first grey light at the window, she slept. In the morning, Adrian kept his word. After breakfast, he took up an electric lantern and a coil of rope and a long iron bar, and he led Eleanor to the low door beneath the stairs, and this time, by daylight, with the lantern throwing its hard white beam ahead of them, they went down. The stair beyond the door was stone, worn into shallow troughs by centuries of feet, and it turned upon itself as it descended. Down past the level of the kitchen cellars, down past racks of ancient bottles furred with dust, down into a part of the house that felt older than the house itself, as though Heartwood had been built upon the bones of something earlier. The air grew colder and wetter with every step. The walls changed from dressed stone to rough-hewn rock, and then to the living rock of the hillside itself. And the sound of the water grew louder, until at the bottom of the stair they came out into a low vaulted chamber, where the underground stream ran black and quick through a channel cut into the floor, disappearing into a dark mouth in the far wall. "Here," Adrian said, his voice echoing. "This is where I found her. That last night, Margaret, standing right here, at the edge of the water, in her nightdress, with a lamp in her hand, 80-some years old and not afraid at all. She had been coming down here," he said, "for weeks. I did not know. She hid it from me. And when I found her, she turned and looked at me and she said, 'It is here, Adrian, after all these years. She is here.'" He raised the lantern, and its beam swept across the far wall, the wall into which the stream vanished, and Eleanor saw it then, and her heart stopped. The wall was not all natural rock. A portion of it, perhaps 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, had been built up, bricked over, the mortar a different colour from the ancient stone around it, newer, though still very old, the work of perhaps 60 years before. And into the mortar, while it was still wet, all those years ago, someone had pressed a shape with their fingers, a crude and desperate shape, scratched and gouged, the marks of fingernails, as though someone on the far side of that wall had clawed at it while it sat. Eleanor crossed to it slowly. She put out her hand and laid her palm flat against the bricks, and they were cold, colder than the rest of the chamber, and from behind them, very faint, so faint she could not be sure she did not imagine it, came the sound of water dripping in an enclosed space, and beneath that, beneath everything, the slow and patient knocking. 3 knocks. Silence. 3 knocks. Eleanor took her hand away. Her face was white. "There is a room behind this wall," she said. "There is a room behind this wall, and someone sealed it, and the water runs through it, and that is what we hear at night." Adrian said nothing. His silence was answer enough. They went up out of the dark together, neither of them speaking, and they did not go down again that day, nor the next. For there are some thresholds that the mind must walk all the way around before it can bring itself to cross, and the thing behind the wall had waited 60 years and could wait a little longer. But everything was different now. The knowledge sat between them at every meal, and the house seemed to lean in closer about them, and the autumn weather, which had been bright, turned grey and wild. With great winds coming up out of the north to batter the old windows and send the leaves streaming down from the lime trees, so that the avenue was carpeted in gold, and the world beyond Hartwood seemed to recede, to grow unreal, until there was nothing left but the two of them, and the house, and the thing in the dark below. It was on the 3rd night after the cellar that the storm broke fully, and the electricity failed, plunging the whole house into darkness, and Eleanor came down to the kitchen to find Adrian lighting candles and oil lamps against the dark, his face gold and shadow in the flame-light, and there was something in the wildness of the night, in the howl of the wind and the lash of the rain against the glass, that broke down the last of the careful walls between them. They sat together by the great kitchen range with the candles burning and a bottle of Margaret's old wine between them, and they talked, truly talked, for the first time, and Adrian told her the thing he had been running from when he came to Hartwood 11 years before. He had been a teacher, he said, in another life, in a city far to the south, and he had been married. And his wife and his young daughter had died together in an accident on a winter road, and he had not been able to remain in the world that had held them, the world of school bells and Sunday lunches and small ordinary joys, and so he had run north and north again, until he had washed up at the gates of Hartwood with nothing left. And an old woman he had never met had looked at him with her fierce, clear eyes and said, "You will do," and taken him in. "I stopped," he said, looking into the fire. "When they died, I stopped. I have been a sort of ghost myself these 11 years, Eleanor, keeping an old woman company in a house full of the dead. It suited me. I did not want to feel anything ever again." He looked up at her then, and the firelight was in his grey eyes, and his voice, when he went on, was very low. "And then you came up the drive in that ridiculous borrowed car," he said, "and I watched you from the gallery window, and you got out and you looked up at the house, and I felt something move in me that I thought had died with them. And I have been fighting it ever since, because I am afraid of it, Eleanor. I am afraid to want anything again, because everything I have ever wanted, the world has taken from me." Eleanor's own eyes were wet. She reached across the small space between their chairs and took his hand, and he let her, and his hand was warm and rough, and it closed around hers. And for a long moment they sat there in the candlelight, with the storm raging outside, and held on to one another like two people clinging to the same spar in a wide, dark sea. "I was married too," she said softly. "He was not a kind man. By the end I had made myself small, so small, trying not to give him reasons. When it was over, I told myself I would never let anyone close enough to do that again. I came here to be alone. I wanted to be alone. She tightened her fingers around his. And then there was you, she said. Careful, sad you, making me coffee the way I like it without my ever telling you. They did not kiss that night. It was not yet time for that, and they both knew it, with the storm and the dark and the dead all around them. But something was settled between them in the candlelight, something acknowledged at last, and when Eleanor finally went up to bed, she carried a candle Adrian had lit for her, and at her door he stood a moment. And this time he did reach out, and he touched her cheek, just once, with the backs of his fingers, very gently, as though she was something that might break. And he said, "Good night, Eleanor," and she carried the warmth of that small touch into her dreams. The storm blew itself out by morning, and in the bright washed light of the day after, with the wind gone and the sky a high pale blue, and the whole sodden world steaming gently in the new sun, they went down into the dark a second time, and this time they brought the iron bar, and this time they did not turn back. The iron bar bit into the old mortar with a sound that rang through the vaulted chamber and echoed away down the black throat of the water channel, and Adrian worked steadily, methodically, the muscles of his back and shoulders moving beneath his shirt, while Eleanor held the lantern and watched the wall give up its bricks, one by one. They came away more easily than she had expected, the mortar gone soft and crumbling with the damp of 60 years, and Adrian caught each brick as it loosened and set it aside in a neat and growing pile. And slowly, a dark gap opened in the wall, a breath of trapped and ancient air sighing out of it, cold and stale and smelling of wet stone and time. And Eleanor's heart beat so hard she thought he must surely hear it over the running of the water. When the gap was large enough, Adrian set down the bar. He took the lantern from her, and he looked at her, and in his grey eyes she saw her own fear mirrored, and her own resolve. "Together," he said, and she nodded, and together they leaned into the opening and raised the lantern, and its hard white light fell at last upon the secret that Hartwood had kept for 60 years. It was a small chamber, no more than 8 feet square, hewn from the living rock, and through one corner of it the underground stream ran in its channel, the same water that ran through the outer chamber, so that whoever had been sealed in here had been sealed in with the sound of it forever. The walls were bare, and against the far wall, where the stone was driest, sat a small iron strongbox, and beside the strongbox, propped in the corner with a tenderness that even now, even after all these years, was somehow visible in the arrangement of it, were the remains of what had once been a chair. And upon the chair, and this was the thing that stopped the breath in Eleanor's throat and brought tears springing hot to her eyes, lay a long pale gown, a woman's gown of 60 years before. Laid out carefully, almost reverently, its fabric gone grey and fragile as a moth's wing, empty now, for the years and the damp and the patient work of time had done what they do, but unmistakably, achingly, the gown of a young woman arranged with care, as though someone had laid her down to sleep. "Clara," Eleanor whispered. "Oh, Clara." They did not go in at once. They stood at the broken wall a long while in silence, and the water ran, and the lantern light was steady. And slowly Eleanor understood that this was not a place of horror, but a place of terrible sorrow, that whatever had happened here 60 years before had ended not in violence in this room, but in something quieter and sadder. That someone had laid this girl to rest with the only tenderness available to them, with a chair and a gown and the eternal company of the running water, and had then sealed the wall, not to hide a crime perhaps, but to make a grave. It was Adrian who climbed through first, and then he reached back and helped Eleanor through, and they stood together in the small stone room where Clara Hartwood had lain for 60 years, and Adrian knelt by the iron strongbox, and it was not locked, and he opened it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, were papers. Letters, a great bundle of them, tied with a faded ribbon, a diary bound in cracked leather, and on the very top, folded once, a single sheet covered in a hand that was not Margaret's spidery script, but something rounder, younger, a girl's hand, and Adrian lifted it out and unfolded it and held it to the lantern, and together they read the last words of Clara Hartwood, written 60 years before in the dark, by a girl who had known she was not going to be found. "If you are reading this," the letter began, "then the water has shown you the way at last, as I always believed it would, for the water is the only thing in this house that cannot be made to lie. My name is Clara Hartwood, and I am 19 years old, and I am going to die in this room, and I want whoever finds me to know the truth of it, because the truth is the only thing I have left to leave behind. I was not murdered. Let that be known first of all, so that no innocent soul is blamed. I came down here myself, of my own choosing, on the worst night of my life, and what happened after was an accident of stone and water, and bad fortune that no living hand intended. But the reason I came down here, the thing that drove me into the dark, that was no accident, and that is the truth I must set down." Eleanor and Adrian read on, kneeling together in the lantern light, and the story rose up out of the old pages and filled the small stone room. The story of a girl of 1960 years before, the younger and wilder of two sisters, who had fallen in love that summer with a young man from the village below, a gardener's son, poor and clever and kind, and who had been forbidden by her family, by her cold and proud father, from ever seeing him again. Because the Hartwoods did not marry gardeners' sons, they had planned to run away together. They had arranged it all, in secret, a meeting at midnight, a horse, a road south, a new life. And Clara had crept down through the house on the appointed night, down toward the cellar door that led out below the terrace, the quickest way to the lane where he would be waiting, carrying a lamp, her heart full of hope and terror, and she had taken a wrong turning in the dark, down the old stone stair, down toward the water, because she did not know the lower house. No one did. And the door at the bottom, the door into this very chamber, had swung shut behind her in a draught, and the latch, the old broken latch, had fallen, and she had been trapped. Eleanor's tears were falling now, freely dropping onto the stone. She had screamed, the letter said. She had screamed and beaten on the door and the walls until her hands bled. 3 knocks, and then listening. 3 knocks, and then listening. But the water was loud, and the chamber was deep, and the house was vast and asleep, and no one heard, or no one who heard understood, and by the time anyone thought to search the lower house, days later she had been past calling. And so she had done the only thing left to her. She had taken the strongbox that stood already in the chamber, some forgotten cache of the house, and she had emptied it of its old documents and filled it instead with her letters and her diary and this last account, so that someday, when the water led someone down, the truth would be known. "I do not blame the house," the letter ended. "I do not even blame my father, though he is the cause of it, with his pride. I blame only the dark and the bad luck of a fallen latch. Tell the gardener's son, if he yet lives, that I was coming to him, that I never changed my mind, that I was thinking of his face at the very end. And tell my sister Margaret, whom I love best of all the world, that I am not afraid, and that she must not let this house make her bitter, and that she must live and love, and not spend her life mourning a girl who chose, even at the end, to be glad that she had loved at all. The letter was signed, simply, Clara for a long time, neither of them could speak. The water ran, the lantern burned, and Eleanor understood at last the full weight of what Margaret had done with her life, the sister left behind, who had never believed the lie of the runaway marriage, who had searched for 60 years, who had found at the very end the wall and the water and known what lay behind it, and who had not had the strength to break it open herself, and so had reached out across death to bring here the one person in the world who wore Clara's face, the grandniece with her grandmother's eyes, to finish the long searching and let the truth come up at last into the light. They brought the strongbox up out of the dark, and the letters and the diary, but they did not disturb the gown nor the chair, for it seemed to both of them that this was a grave now, and ought to be treated as one, and they agreed without speaking much about it that they would do this properly, that they would bring the authorities and a priest and lay Clara Hartwood to rest in the open air and the daylight at last, in the family plot behind the little chapel on the hill above the lake, beside the sister who had searched for her so long. But that was for the days to come. That first day, when they came up at last into the afternoon light, blinking and shaken, they did not speak at all. Adrian set the strongbox on the kitchen table, and they sat and looked at it, and at each other, and Eleanor saw that he had been weeping too, this careful, grave man who had decided long ago never to feel anything again, and she rose and went to him and put her arms around him, and he held her, and they stood in the kitchen of the great old house and held one another while the autumn light moved slowly across the flagstones, and there was nothing of passion in it yet, only a vast shared tenderness, two broken people holding each other up at the end of a long darkness. Over the days that followed, the practical world reasserted itself, as it always does. There were telephone calls to be made, the nearest of them from the village, for Hartwood had no working line. And Adrian drove down in the old car to make them, while Eleanor stayed and read, slowly and with great care, through Clara's diary and the bundle of her letters, piecing together the full shape of that lost summer of 60 years before. The young man's name had been Thomas Ashby, she learned, the gardener's son, and through the letters his voice came alive, gentle and bright and full of plans, and Eleanor came to love him a little herself, this boy 60 years dead, who had waited in a cold lane at midnight for a girl who never came, and who had been told, surely in the days after, that she had run off with someone else, that she had jilted him, that she had thought better of throwing herself away on a gardener's son. She wondered what had become of him. Whether he had married, had children, grown old in the village below, carrying that wound all his life, the belief that the girl he loved had abandoned him. And so when Adrian returned from the village that evening, she asked him, and his face grew thoughtful. And he said that the Ashbys were still there, that there was an Ashby still working land in the valley, an old man now, the grandson perhaps, or the great-nephew of the Thomas Ashby of the letters, and that the name was a known one in those parts. And Eleanor knew then what the last part of her task must be. Clara had asked, in her final letter, that the gardener's son be told. It was 60 years too late for Thomas Ashby himself, but the truth could still come home to his people, and the long lie could be undone, and perhaps somewhere in that there was a kind of peace to be found, for the living if not for the dead. So a few days later, when the authorities had come and gone, when a kind and careful coroner had heard their story and examined the chamber and recorded at last the truth of Clara Hartwood's death as a tragic accident 60 years past, when arrangements had been made for the girl to be brought up gently and laid to rest, Eleanor and Adrian drove down together into the village below Hartwood. down out of the high green folds of the hills and into the valley where the river ran, and the houses clustered grey and old around a square stone church, and they sought out the Ashby farm. It lay at the edge of the village, a low and ancient farmhouse with a yard full of dogs and a barn and fields rising behind, and the man who came out to meet them, wiping his hands on a cloth, was old indeed. 80 if he was a day, with a face brown, and seemed as a walnut, and bright blue eyes that fixed on Eleanor as she climbed out of the car and went suddenly very still. He stood and stared at her for a long moment in the farmyard, with the dogs milling around his boots, and then he said, in a voice gone strange and unsteady, "Who are you?" Eleanor stopped. "I am sorry to come unannounced," she said. "My name is Eleanor Vance. I have inherited Hartwood Hall up the hill, and I have come because I have something to tell you, something about your family, something that happened a very long time ago." But the old man was not listening to her words. He was looking at her face, drinking it in, and his blue eyes had filled with tears, and he said, very softly, "You have her face. You have Clara's face. I have seen her photograph 1,000 times. My grandfather kept it by his bed until the day he died. You have her face." And Eleanor understood that she had come to the right place, and that the story was older and deeper than she had known, and that some things 60 years buried were about to come up at last into the light of an ordinary autumn afternoon, in a farmyard, among the dogs. His name was Thomas Ashby too, named for his grandfather, and he took them into the low warm kitchen of the farmhouse and made them tea with his own gnarled hands, and he told them the other half of the story. The half that had lived all these years in the valley below while Margaret grieved alone in the house above. His grandfather, the first Thomas, had loved a girl from the great house. Everyone in the family knew the tale, had waited for her one night to run away together, and she had never come, and word had come down soon after that she had eloped with another, a richer man, and had gone away south and never returned. And the first Thomas had been broken by it, the old man said, truly broken, had not married for many years, had become a hard and silent man, and only late in life had taken a wife and had a son, and that son had been the old man's father, so that the whole of their family, in a sense, the old man said with a sad smile, had grown out of the soil of that grief, had only come to exist at all because Clara Hartwood had, as they believed, broken his grandfather's heart and freed him at last, years later, to love someone else. He never believed she had jilted him, the old man said, not in his heart. He used to say, "Your gran was not the only woman I ever loved, and the first one, the one from the hall, she would never have left me. Not Clara." Something happened to her, something they covered up, and he would not be argued out of it, though my own gran told him 100 times he was a foolish old man clinging to a fancy. He went to his grave saying it. Eleanor reached into her bag then and brought out the letters, Clara's letters, the bundle tied with faded ribbon, and she laid them gently on the scrubbed kitchen table before the old man, and she told him, as kindly as she could, what they had found behind the wall in the dark below Hartwood, and what Clara had written there at the end, and how she had died, not faithless, but faithful, not fled, but trapped, thinking of his grandfather's face at the very last. The old man wept. He was not ashamed of it, an old farmer weeping at his own kitchen table, and Eleanor and Adrian sat with him and let him weep, and after a while he took up the letters in his trembling old hands and held them as though they were made of glass, and he said, he was right. All those years they told him he was a foolish old man, and he was right. She never left him. He looked up at Eleanor with his streaming blue eyes. He would have given anything, he said, anything in the world to have known this, to have died knowing she had been coming to him. And now, I know it for him. And somehow, that is almost the same. Somehow, that is almost enough. They stayed a long while at the farm that afternoon, and when at last they rose to go, the old man took Eleanor's hand in both of his and held it, and looked into her face, into Clara's face, and he said, "Thank you, Lars. You have given my grandfather back to me, the true man, not the bitter one. And you have given Clara back to all of us. We will come to her funeral every Ashby in the valley, and we will stand by her grave, and we will be the family she never got to marry into, 60 years late." And as Eleanor and Adrian drove back up the hill in the failing light, neither of them spoke for a long time, both of them full to the brim with the strange, sad joy of it, the way a grief 60 years old had been, not healed, for some griefs cannot be healed, but completed, brought to its proper end, like a piece of music allowed at last to resolve its final chord. They buried Clara Hartwood on a still grey morning in late October in the family plot behind the little chapel on the hill, in a plain coffin under a sky the colour of pearl, with the whole valley come up to stand around the grave. The Ashbys came, every one of them, as the old man had promised, 24 of them in their dark Sunday clothes, and they stood on one side of the grave as though they were indeed the family she had meant to marry into, and on the other side stood Eleanor and Adrian, the only Hartwoods left, and a young priest from the village said the words that should have been said 60 years before, and Clara was laid in the earth beside Margaret at last. The two sisters together again under the turning leaves. Eleanor had brought white roses from the overgrown garden, the descendants, perhaps, of roses Clara herself had known, and she laid them on the coffin, and as the first earth fell she felt Adrian's hand find hers, and close around it, and she held on, and across the grave the old farmer Thomas Ashby caught her eye and nodded once, slowly. And there were tears on every face, and yet it was not, in the end, a sorrowful morning. It was a morning of release. 60 years of lie and silence and grief laid finally to rest, and the truth standing up clean and clear in the cold autumn light. Afterward they all went down to the village hall, Hartwood and Ashby and half the valley besides, and there was tea and there was cake, and there was, slowly, gently, something almost like a celebration. For a wound that old, when it finally closes, leaves a strange lightness behind it. And Eleanor moved among these people, these strangers who were not quite strangers, who looked at her with a tenderness that was really for a girl 60 years dead, and she felt for the first time since she had come to that high, lonely place that she was not alone in the world, that she had a place here, that the threads of this story had wound themselves around her and bound her to this valley and these hills and this old grey house, and to the grave grey man at her side who had not let go of her hand all morning. That night, back at Hartwood, with the house quiet and the knocking gone from below at last, gone for ever now that the wall was open and the grave was filled and Clara was at rest, they sat together by the kitchen fire, and Adrian poured the last of Margaret's good wine, and they were quiet for a long time, easy in the silence, and then Eleanor said, "What happens now?" He looked at her. "With what?" he said. "With everything," she said. "With the house, with the estate, with you." She turned to face him fully, and her heart was beating, but she had spent too long being small and careful and afraid, and she would not be those things any longer, not after everything they had seen and done together in the dark. "With us," she said. He was silent a moment. Then he said, "That depends on you, Eleanor. This is your house now, your land, your life. I am the old steward who came with the furniture. I will go, if you want me to go. I have a little money saved, and the world is wide, and I would not blame you after all this for wanting a fresh start somewhere with no ghosts in it." He said it steadily, looking at the fire, but his hand, where it rested on his knee, was not steady at all, and Eleanor saw it, because she had spent her whole life watching people, learning to read the small involuntary truths that bodies tell when mouths are busy lying. And she rose from her chair, and she crossed the small space between them, and she knelt before him on the warm flagstones, and took his face in both her hands, and turned it from the fire to her. And she said, "You foolish, careful man, do you truly not see it? I do not want a fresh start with no ghosts in it. I want this house, and its ghosts, and its dark water, and its sad, long story. And I want you. I have wanted you since the first week, since you played that piano in the gallery and stopped when you saw me. I do not want you to go. I want you to stay. I want you to stay forever." And then she kissed him, there in the firelight, kissed him gently and then not gently at all. And after a long, startled moment, his arms came up and around her, and he kissed her back. And all the careful distance of all those weeks dissolved at once in the warmth of it. Two people who had both decided long ago that love was a thing the world would only take from them again, finding in each other the courage to risk it one more time. They held one another a long while by the fire, and there was no need for more words that night. Only the warmth and the wine and the great quiet house settled peaceful around them at last. But love, even love found in the ashes of an old grief, does not arrive into an empty world. And the next morning brought the first shadow of the trouble that was to come. It arrived in the form of a letter, carried up the hill by the village postman, who came twice a week now that Hartwood was lived in again, a long official envelope from a firm of solicitors in the city, and Eleanor opened it at the kitchen table while Adrian made the coffee, and as she read, the warmth of the night before drained slowly out of her face. "What is it?" Adrian said, setting down the pot. She read it through twice before she answered. "There is a claim," she said slowly, "against the estate. A man. A distant cousin, it says here, descended from another branch of the family, who maintains that the will is invalid, that Margaret was not of sound mind in her final years, that her obsession with her dead sister had unbalanced her, and that the estate should pass not to me, but to him, as the nearest male heir of the older line." She looked up. "He is called Gerald Hartwood. And he is coming here, in person, the day after tomorrow, with his solicitor, to inspect the property he says is rightfully his." Adrian's face had gone very still and very hard. "I know the name," he said quietly. "He came here once, years ago, while Margaret was still alive. He wanted her to sell the estate to a development company he was involved with, to clear the woods and drain the lake and put up houses. She refused him. She refused him in language I will not repeat, and she had me show him to the gate, and he went away, promising she would regret it." He paused. "He is not a kind man, Eleanor, and if he succeeds in breaking the will, he will not keep Hartwood. He will sell it for parts. The woods, the lake, the house itself, all of it, gone." Eleanor folded the letter slowly. She thought of Clara's grave on the hill, of the white roses, of the old farmer's streaming blue eyes, of the long, sad story that had only just been brought to its rest. She thought of the ivy on the western wall and the piano in the gallery and the underground stream running black and quick through the dark, of all of it passing into the hands of a man who would drain the lake and fell the lime trees and sell the bones of the house for whatever they would fetch. And she found, rising in her, something she had not felt in years, something her ruined marriage had taught her to bury deep, a clean, hot anger, and beneath the anger, harder and steadier, a resolve. "He will not have it," she said. Adrian looked at her. "He will not have one stone of it," she said. "Not the house, not the lake, not the woods, not Clara's grave. Margaret left this place to me, and I am going to keep it, and I am going to keep you, and I am going to make something living out of this house of the dead if it is the last thing I do." She stood up from the table. "Let him come," she said. "Let him come the day after tomorrow with his solicitor and his claim. We will be ready for him." That night, Eleanor could not sleep, and rather than lie awake, she rose and lit a lamp and went up to Margaret's study, the room of the red crosses, where Clara's diary now lay among the dead woman's notebooks, and she sat at the desk beneath the dark window and read the diary again, from the beginning, more slowly this time, not for the love story now, but for anything, any small thing, that might help them against the man who was coming. And it was there, near the very end of the diary, in an entry written only days before Clara's last walk into the dark, that she found it. Clara had written of the strongbox. She had described, in passing, how on the day she discovered the lower chamber, exploring the house she loved, she had found the old iron strongbox already there, and how it had not been empty, how it had held a sheaf of old documents which she had taken out and set aside on the chamber floor to make room for her own letters, never dreaming she would die before she could replace them. And she had described what those documents were. They were the deeds, the original founding deeds of the Hartwood estate, and with them Clara wrote a settlement, a legal instrument of some kind that her grandfather had drawn up, a thing she only half understood, but which concerned the inheritance of the estate, which laid down, she thought, that Hartwood was never to pass out of the direct line, never to be sold or divided, but was to descend always to the one who loved it best and would keep it whole. Eleanor sat very still in the lamplight. The original deeds, the settlement, taken out of the strongbox 60 years before and set aside on the floor of the chamber, and then, when the wall was bricked up to make Clara's grave, sealed in there with her, in the dark, with the running water, for 60 years. They had brought up the strongbox, they had brought up Clara's letters and her diary, but they had not searched the floor of the chamber, the dark corners beyond the lantern's reach, because they had been too overcome by grief and reverence to do more than take what lay in plain sight and climb back out into the light. The documents might still be there. Eleanor did not wait for morning. She woke Adrian and told him what she had found, and his eyes went wide in the lamplight, and within the hour the two of them were once again descending the old stone stair, down into the cold and the dark and the running water, with the lantern and a second lamp besides, and this time they climbed through the broken wall into the small grave chamber, not to mourn, but to search, gently, reverently, careful of the gown and the chair, going over every inch of the stone floor in the corners the lantern had not reached before. And there, in the driest corner, behind the chair, where they had been wrapped in the same oilcloth that had protected the strongbox, sealed against the damp by a girl who had thought to preserve them even in her extremity, they found the documents. The deeds were there, ancient and beautiful, the founding grant of Hartwood in a crabbed antique hand. And with them was the settlement, the legal instrument Clara had half understood, and Adrian, who had read law in his youth before he was a teacher, before he was a ghost, held it to the lamp and read it through with growing wonder. And when he had finished, he looked up at Eleanor with something like awe. "This changes everything," he said. This is an entail, Eleanor, a very old and very strong one, drawn up by your great-great-grandfather and never broken, because it was lost, sealed down here, all these years. It binds the estate to descend to a named line and forbids absolutely its sale or division. And it contains a provision, a most unusual provision, that in the absence of a direct heir of the body, the estate is to pass to whichever relation the last holder names in their will as the keeper of Heartwood, the one who will keep it whole and unsold. He lowered the paper. Margaret named you, he said, in her will, not just as heir, but in those very words. To keep Heartwood whole. I drafted it with her. I thought it only sentiment. But it is not sentiment, Eleanor. It is the precise language of this settlement, which she must have known of, which she must have read of in the old family papers, even if she never found the document itself. She built your inheritance on a foundation she could not prove existed. And we have just dug it up out of her sister's grave. They brought the documents up into the light, and they did not sleep that night at all, but sat at the kitchen table as the dawn came grey and then gold over the eastern hills, reading and rereading the old settlement, understanding slowly the full shape of what they held. Gerald Heartwood was descended from an older branch. It was true. But the entail did not pass to the eldest male line. It passed to the named keeper. And Margaret had named Eleanor in the exact words the settlement required. And the settlement, sealed 60 years in the dark, was as binding now as the day it was drawn. The claim against the will would shatter against it like a wave against rock. When Gerald Heartwood came up the long drive 2 days later in a great gleaming car that looked absurd against the wild gardens and the ivy and the ancient stone, with his solicitor beside him and triumph in his eyes, he found Eleanor waiting for him at the top of the front steps, calm and composed in a dark dress, with Adrian at her shoulder, and he found, when at last they were all seated in the morning room, and the documents were laid out upon the table that he had come a very long way to lose. He was a heavy, florid man of perhaps 60, expensively dressed, with a loud, confident voice and small, cold eyes, and he began by being expansive, almost kindly, explaining to Eleanor, as though to a child, how very sorry he was, how unfortunate it all was, how an unstable old woman's whim could not be allowed to stand against the proper order of inheritance, how he was sure they could come to some arrangement, some small settlement to compensate her for her trouble before she vacated the property. Eleanor let him talk. She let him talk himself out entirely, while his solicitor nodded along and Adrian sat silent and watchful at her side. And only when Gerald had quite finished, when he sat back with the satisfied air of a man who has explained the obvious to a simpleton, did she lean forward and slide the old settlement across the table to his solicitor and say, quietly, "Before you go any further, I think your client should read this." The solicitor read it. He read it slowly, and then he read it again, and Eleanor watched the confidence drain out of his face, the way the warmth had drained out of her own 2 mornings before, and when he had finished he set the document down very carefully, as a man sets down something he has discovered to be fragile and valuable, and he turned to his client and said, in a low and careful voice, "Mr. Heartwood, I think we should speak privately before this goes any further." But Gerald Heartwood was not a man accustomed to losing, and he did not understand yet that he had lost, and he snatched up the paper himself and read it, his florid face growing redder as he went, and when he had grasped the shape of it, he threw it down on the table and surged to his feet, and the kindly mask was gone entirely now. And what was beneath it was ugly. "This is a forgery," he said. "This is some piece of nonsense you have cooked up. No such document exists, it has never been mentioned, never been filed. You cannot simply produce a 60-year-old paper out of thin air and expect a court to. It was not produced out of thin air, Eleanor said. It was produced out of the ground. It was sealed in a chamber beneath this house for 60 years, alongside the body of Margaret's sister Clara, whose death was ruled an accident by the county coroner not 2 weeks ago, a matter of public record which you are welcome to verify. The deeds were sealed with it. They will be authenticated. And the entail they establish is, I am advised, entirely binding, and it names me, in the precise words Margaret used in her will as the keeper of Heartwood. She rose to face him across the table, and she was not afraid of him. Not at all, this loud red man who had wanted to drain the lake and fell the lime trees, and she found that the not being afraid was its own kind of joy. You have no claim here, Mr. Heartwood, she said. You never did. The will is sound, and even were it not, the entail would defeat you, and I think your own solicitor has just understood that, even if you have not. So you may go back to your development company and tell them that Heartwood is not for sale, that it will never be for sale, that it is bound by the hand of a man dead 200 years to descend forever to those who will keep it whole. And you may not come back. For a moment she thought he might strike the table, or shout, or worse, for there was real fury in his small, cold eyes. But Adrian had risen too, quietly, to stand at her side, a tall and steady presence, and the solicitor had his client by the elbow, and was murmuring urgently in his ear, words like authenticated and coroner and untenable and costs. And, slowly, the fury in Gerald Heartwood curdled into something smaller and meaner, a sullen, baffled rage, and he gathered his coat and his dignity, what was left of it, and he went to the door. And there he turned back, and he looked around the morning room, at the faded green silk, and the fire and the tall windows giving on to the wild gardens, and he said, with a sneer, You are welcome to it. A crumbling pile in the middle of nowhere, full of ghosts and damp. You will be sick of it inside a year. Perhaps, Eleanor said, but it is mine to be sick of, and not yours to destroy. Good day, Mr. Heartwood. And she watched from the top of the front steps as the great gleaming car turned and went back down the long drive beneath the lime trees and out through the mossy gateposts, and was gone. And she stood there a long time in the cold, bright air after the sound of its engine had faded, looking out over the land that was hers now beyond all challenge, the woods and the lake and the wild gardens and the grave on the hill. And she felt Adrian come to stand beside her, and his hand found hers, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and neither of them said anything at all. Because there was nothing that needed saying. The danger had passed. Heartwood was safe. And the long, strange chapter that had begun with a letter and a wax seal in a little flower shop above a bakery had come, at last, to its close. But endings, the true ones, are also beginnings, and the months that followed were the making of a new life out of the ruins of the old. The winter came hard to the high hills, and Heartwood, which had stood half dead and shuttered for so long, came slowly back to life under their hands. They could not restore 40 rooms, the two of them, nor would they have wanted to, but they took the heart of the house, the kitchen and the morning room and the gallery and a handful of bedrooms in the eastern wing, and they made it warm and living again, with fires in the grates and lamps in the windows, so that a traveller coming up the valley in the early dark of a winter evening would see Heartwood glowing on its hill like a ship at anchor, and know that someone was home. Adrian repaired the great range and the worst of the roof, and the ancient boiler that fed a few of the radiators, and Eleanor, who had spent years among cut flowers in a city shop, turned her attention to the gardens, clearing the wild box hedges back into something like their old shape. finding beneath the years of neglect the bones of the formal terraces, the lines of an old rose walk, the stone basin of a fountain long dry. She found, working in the cold earth through that first winter and into the spring, that the gardens of Heartwood were a kind of buried letter too, a thing made with love by hands long dead, waiting only for someone to read them again, and she read them. And slowly, season by season, she began to bring them back. They were married in the spring, quietly, in the little chapel on the hill above the lake, with the old farmer Thomas Ashby to give Eleanor away. For there was no one living with a better right, he said, no one in all the world. And half the valley came up the hill again as they had come for the funeral, but in lighter clothes now, and with flowers, and afterward there was a feast in the great hall of Heartwood, the first the old house had seen in 60 years. The long table laid the length of the chessboard floor beneath the watching portraits, and there was music. And Adrian played the piano in the gallery, no longer stopping when anyone came near, and the sound of it filled the house to its dark rafters. Slow and aching and full of longing still, but the longing answered now, the longing come home. But that spring wedding lay still some months ahead on the night Gerald Heartwood's car vanished down the drive, and the winter that came between was its own long, quiet chapter, and it was in that winter, more than in any single dramatic hour, that Eleanor and Adrian truly came to know one another, and that the love between them, which had kindled in fear and darkness, learned how to burn steady in the ordinary light of day. The snows came early to the high hills that year, great soft falls that buried the gardens and silenced the woods and cut Heartwood off from the valley for days at a time, so that there was nothing for the two of them to do but be together in the warm heart of the house. And they found, to their quiet wonder, that they never tired of it. They fell into the gentle rhythms of a shared life. In the mornings, Adrian rose first and lit the kitchen range and made the coffee, and Eleanor came down to find it ready, and they ate together at the scrubbed deal table while the light came grey and slow over the snow. In the afternoons, when the weather allowed, they walked out into the white woods together, their breath smoking in the cold, and Adrian showed her the estate she had inherited, the places he had come to love in his 11 solitary years, the frozen lake where the reeds stood stiff with ice, the old ice house half buried in a bank, the ancient yew in the chapel yard that was older than the house itself, older than the family. A tree that had stood on that hill, he said, since before there were Heartwoods to plant gardens or dig graves or break their hearts. And in the long evenings they sat by the fire and they talked, and they read aloud to one another, and slowly, piece by piece, they gave each other the whole of their histories, the good and the bad of them, holding nothing back, because they had passed together through a darkness that had burned away all their old defences, and there was no longer any reason to be anything but wholly known. Eleanor told him of her marriage, the whole of it, the slow years of being made smaller, the careful cruelty, the way she had come at last to believe the things her husband told her about herself, that she was foolish, that she was too much, that no one else would ever want her, and how it had taken her years after the divorce to understand that none of it had been true, and how some small frightened part of her had gone on half believing it anyway, until she had driven up a long gravel drive and a grave grey man had watched her from a gallery window and seen, she now knew, not a foolish woman, not a difficult woman, but simply Eleanor, and wanted her. And Adrian told her, in turn, more of his lost wife and his lost daughter than he had ever told another soul. Not the bare fact of the accident that he had given her on the night of the storm, but the small living details, the way his daughter had laughed, the songs his wife had sung, the ordinary golden texture of the life that had been taken from him, and as he spoke of them, his voice did not break. and Eleanor understood that this was a gift he was giving her, the gift of his grief, shared at last, after 11 years of carrying it alone in silence. And she received it as the precious thing it was, and she did not try to soothe it away or fix it, but only listened, and held his hand, and let his dead be real in the room with them, because she had learned, in that house, that the dead do not want to be forgotten, only to be remembered truly, and laid to rest with love. There were difficult days too. They were neither of them young, and neither of them whole, and each carried wounds that did not always lie quiet. There were days when Adrian withdrew into his old silence, when the weight of his griefs came down on him and he could not be reached, and Eleanor learned not to take it as a rejection, but to wait, patiently. The way she waited for a difficult plant to take in the cold ground, and to be there, steady, when he came back to himself. And there were nights when the old fear rose in Eleanor, the terror of being made small again, of giving herself into a man's hands and finding the hands unkind, and on those nights it was Adrian who waited, who did not press, who showed her by 1,000 small, unfailing kindnesses that he was not the man who had hurt her, would never be that man, and slowly, slowly, across that long white winter, the two of them taught each other to trust again, which is the slowest and the hardest and the most necessary of all the lessons that love must learn. And the house itself seemed to lighten around them as they healed. Eleanor had felt it from the first hour, as a thing holding its breath, a house of the dead waiting in the dark, and now, with the wall open and the grave filled, and the truth come up into the light, with fires in the grates and laughter in the kitchen, and the two of them moving through its rooms in love, heartward let its breath go at last. The knocking never came again. The shadows in the lower halls seemed less deep. The portraits in the great hall, which had seemed to watch her so coldly on the day she came, seemed now merely to look down with the mild interest of old family glad to see the place lived in again. Even the underground stream, which had carried such dread in those first nights, became in time a kind of comfort, for they could hear it faintly, still on the quietest nights, running through the dark beneath the house, and Eleanor came to think of it not as the cold companion of a girl's lonely death, but as the patient thing that had kept the truth safe all those years, the only thing in the house that could not be made to lie, and had not lied, but had knocked and knocked in the dark for 60 years until at last someone came who could understand it. It was deep in that winter, on one of the long snowbound evenings, that Eleanor at last did the thing she had been putting off since the day she first entered the dead woman's study, and read her way fully through Margaret's own notebooks, not skimming now for clues, as she had in those frantic first days, but reading slowly, from the very first to the very last, the whole long record of a single human life, spent in faithful waiting. And it broke her heart, and it mended something in her too, and when she had finished, she understood her great-aunt completely, this fierce, strange old woman she had met only once, and loved her, and was grateful beyond words for what the old woman had done. The notebooks began 60 years before, in a young woman's hand not so different from Clara's own, in the weeks after her sister's disappearance, and from the very first entry Margaret had refused the lie. She had written in those first raw pages that she knew her sister, that Clara would never have run away without a word to her, the sister she loved best in all the world, that they had shared every secret since the cradle, and Clara had shared this too, the love for the gardener's son, the half-formed dream of escape, and that Clara had promised, faithfully promised, that whatever she did she would send word, would not leave Margaret to wonder. And no word had come. And so Margaret had known, with the certainty of love, from the very first, that something had happened to her sister inside the walls of Heartwood, and she had set herself, at the age of 22, to the task that would consume the rest of her life. The early notebooks were full of searching, of energy, of hope. She had questioned the servants, walked the grounds, written letters, made inquiries in the village even in one remarkable entry, confronted her own father, the cold, proud man who had forbidden the match, and demanded to know whether he had sent Clara away somewhere. Locked her up, married her off in secret to be rid of the scandal, and her father had struck her across the face for the insult and forbidden the subject ever to be raised again in his house. And Margaret had written, that night, in a hand shaking with rage and grief, "I will find you, Clara. If it takes me the whole of my life, I will find you, and I will not let them bury you in silence." The middle notebooks were harder to read, for they were the record of hope wearing slowly down into something grimmer and more enduring. The years passed. The father died, and then the mother, and the older brother who inherited, and one by one the family dwindled and the great house emptied. And Margaret, who never married, who turned away every suitor, who would not leave Heartwood for so much as a season, became its sole inhabitant, the strange spinster of the Hall, growing slowly old in her search. She mapped the house, room by room, cellar by cellar. She dug in the gardens. She had the lake dragged, once, at vast expense, by men who thought her mad and took her money and found nothing. And through it all, the notebooks recorded, she never once doubted, never once allowed herself the easier grief of believing the lie, but held to the harder truth, that her sister was here, somewhere, waiting to be found, and that she owed it to her, owed it across the years, never to give up. And there were passages in those middle notebooks of such loneliness that Eleanor had to set the book down more than once and press her hand to her mouth, for she recognized that loneliness, having lived a smaller version of it herself. And she grieved for the young woman Margaret had been, who had given up love and marriage and children and the whole warm, ordinary span of a life, and spent it all instead on a dead girl and a cold house and a search that seemed, year after barren year, to lead nowhere. But it had not led nowhere. That was the thing. That was the thing that made Eleanor weep, sitting by the fire in the deep of that winter night, with the snow falling outside and Adrian asleep upstairs. In the very last notebook, in the final year of Margaret's long life, at the age of 90, half blind and failing, the old woman had at last understood the message of the water. She had heard the knocking all her life, the notebooks revealed, had heard it for 60 years and dismissed it always as the sound of the underground stream, until one night, near the end, lying awake in her great bed, it had come to her, suddenly, after 60 years, that the knocking had a rhythm, that it was not the random voice of water at all, but something patterned. 3 knocks and silence. 3 knocks and silence, the rhythm of a thing made by a hand, and she had risen in the dark, 90 years old, and taken a lamp, and gone down at last, all the way down, to the lower chamber following the sound, and stood at last before the bricked-up wall through which the water ran, and laid her old hand against it, and known. She had written that night, in a hand grown huge and shaky and barely legible, only this: she is here, after 60 years. She is behind this wall, and I have not the strength to break it. And I am going to die soon, and I cannot do it, I cannot. And so I must find another way, I must reach beyond my own death. I must bring the one who can finish what I cannot. The girl with Clara's face. She has her grandmother's eyes. she will see what I could not. And then, in the very last entry, written it seemed only days before she died, the final words of the whole long record, 60 years of one woman's faithful love distilled to a single line. When the girl comes, tell her to follow the water down, and tell her, please, that I am sorry to ask it of her, but she is the only one who can let my sister out of the dark. Eleanor closed the last notebook and sat for a long time in the firelight with the tears running freely down her face, and she understood at last the full weight and meaning of her inheritance. She had thought, on the day the letter came, that she had been left a house. She had not been left a house. She had been left a sacred trust, the unfinished work of a life spent in love, handed down across the silence of death from an old woman to the one person in the world who could complete it. And she had completed it, and Clara was free of the dark now, sleeping in the open earth on the hill beside the sister who had never stopped searching for her, and the two of them were together at last, after 60 years, and it was Eleanor who had brought them together. Eleanor with Clara's face and her grandmother's eyes, and there was no inheritance of money or land or great houses in all the world, she understood now, that could equal the worth of that. She had thought, after Gerald Hartwood's car had vanished down the drive, that they had seen the last of him, and for a while it seemed they had. The deeds were sent away to be authenticated and came back confirmed beyond all doubt, the entail upheld, the will unassailable, and the firm of city solicitors wrote no more letters. But a man like Gerald Hartwood does not easily forgive a public defeat, and his defeat had been public, for the strange story of Hartwood. Of the body behind the wall and the 60-year-old grave and the lost document dug up out of the dark had got into the county papers and even, briefly, the papers of the city, and Gerald, who had come to take possession of a quiet inheritance, had instead been made a small and unflattering figure in a story everyone was reading. The grasping cousin who had tried to break a dying woman's will and been routed by a flower shop girl and an old steward. And so, deep in the heart of that snowbound winter, on the longest, darkest night of the year, his spite found its way back up the hill to Hartwood in a form more dangerous than any solicitor's letter. They were woken near midnight by the dogs, the two great shaggy farm dogs the old man Thomas Ashby had pressed upon them, against the loneliness of the hill, he had said, and against trouble. And the dogs were barking, frantic, downstairs, and over their barking Eleanor heard another sound. A sound she knew at once and dreaded, the crackle and roar of fire. They came down to find the old timber porch at the eastern end of the house ablaze, the flames already climbing the ivy toward the upper windows, and in the snow beyond, half seen by the leaping light, two figures running for a car parked down the drive, men Gerald had paid, no doubt, to do the thing he had not the courage to do himself, to burn down the house he could not own. There was no fire brigade that could reach them, not that night, not with the valley road buried under 3 feet of snow. There was only the two of them, and the dogs, and the buckets, and the well, and the deep snow itself, and they fought the fire through the small hours of that longest night with a desperate ferocity, Adrian on the porch roof, beating at the flames with wet sacking, while Eleanor hauled water and packed snow against the burning timbers with her bare hands until they were raw and blistered. The two of them working in a wordless, frantic partnership, and the dogs running and barking, and the flames roaring, and the sparks streaming up into the black snow-laden sky. And there was a long, terrible hour when it might have gone either way, when Eleanor, beating at a line of fire that had run along the base of the wall, looked up and saw Adrian silhouetted against the flames on the roof above her, and was seized by a terror that had nothing to do with the house at all, the terror of losing him, here, now, after everything, and she screamed at him to come down, to leave it, that no house was worth his life, and he had looked down at her through the smoke and the firelight and called back. We did not save Clara from the dark to let them take Heartwood now, and turned and beaten at the flames again. And in the end, they won. As the first grey light came creeping over the snow, they beat out the last of it, and stood together in the trampled, blackened slush before the scorched and smoking ruin of the eastern porch. Soot-streaked, exhausted, their hands burned, their clothes singed, leaning on one another to stay upright, and the house stood. Damaged, scarred, the eastern porch gone, and the ivy of half the wing burned to black skeletons, but standing, saved, theirs, and as they stood there in the dawn, Eleanor began, helplessly, to laugh. A cracked, exhausted laugh that turned almost at once to tears and then back to laughter, and Adrian held her, and she said. Into his sooty shoulder he tried to burn down the whole house, and all he managed was the porch, and Adrian said, grimly, the porch was the newest part. The rest of it is 600 years old and built of stone, and it will be here long after Gerald Heartwood is dust. And that set her laughing again and crying again, and they stood together in the ruined dawn, the two of them, scorched and alive. And the house standing over them, and they had never, Eleanor thought, been so close to anything in all her life as she was to this man in that broken, smoking morning. They went to the law, of course, this time. Arson was a different thing from a contested will, and the men who had fled down the drive had been seen. And one of them, it transpired when the snows cleared and the investigation began, was an employee of the very development company Gerald Heartwood was tied to, and the trail led, slowly but surely, back to Gerald himself. And though the law moves slowly in such matters, and it would be more than a year before it was fully done, the end of it was that Gerald Heartwood, who had wanted Heartwood so badly that he had tried first to steal it and then to burn it, lost in the end far more than a country house, lost his good name and his liberty and his place in the world, and never troubled Eleanor and Adrian again. But all of that lay in the future. In the immediate aftermath of that long night of fire, there was only the two of them, and the saved house, and a thing between them that had been forged finally and unbreakably in the heat of the flames, so that when, a few days later, with their burned hands healing and the smell of smoke still hanging in the eastern wing, Adrian came to her in the gallery where she stood looking out at the snow, and took both her bandaged hands very gently in his own, and asked her, in his low grave voice, whether she would marry him, whether she would truly tie her life to a scarred old house and a scarred old man in the middle of nowhere. There was never the smallest question of what her answer would be. And so they were married in the spring, as has been told, in the little chapel on the hill, with the old farmer to give her away, and half the valley come up to celebrate. And the great hall of Heartwood filled with music and light for the first time in 60 years. But a wedding is not an ending either, only another doorway, and the life that lay beyond it was the truest part of the whole long story, the ordinary, daily happiness that the two of them built, year upon patient year, in the old house above the lake. They restored the eastern porch that summer, and Adrian, who had a feeling for old things, rebuilt it as it had been, in seasoned oak, so that within a few years you could not tell it from the original, save that the ivy on that wing grew younger and greener than the rest. They restored more of the house too, slowly as they could afford it. Not to turn it into a museum, but to make it a home large enough for the life they hoped to fill it with. And that life came in time for the spring after their marriage. Eleanor found herself with child, and the following winter, in the great four-poster bed where Margaret had died and where Eleanor herself had spent her first uneasy night in the house, she gave birth to a daughter. In the warmth of a fire, Adrian had laid himself, with the snow falling soft outside, and the old farmer's wife come up from the valley to help. They named her Clara. There was never any question of it, and it seemed to Eleanor, holding her newborn daughter in the firelight of that winter night, that some long circle had closed at last, that the name Clara, which had meant for 60 years only loss and silence and a girl swallowed by the dark, meant now a beginning, a warm new life come into a house that had learned again how to live, and that somewhere, on the hill above the lake, in the family plot behind the chapel, two sisters who had loved each other beyond death might be, in whatever way the dead are glad of anything. Glad. The little girl grew up wild and happy in the great house and its wild gardens, the way Clara and Margaret must once have grown, two sisters laughing on the front steps in a photograph 60 years old. And she had her mother's face, which was Clara's face, and her father's grave grey eyes, and she ran through the rooms that had stood empty and shrouded for so long, and filled them with noise and life, and she was not afraid of the house at all, not of its dark lower halls, nor its watching portraits, nor the faint sound of the underground stream on quiet nights, for to her it was simply home, the only home she had ever known, and there is no ghost in all the world that can haunt a house where a child is happy. They kept the lower chamber as it was. They did not seal it again, but neither did they disturb it, and once a year, on the anniversary of the day they had opened the wall, Eleanor and Adrian went down together into the dark with a lamp, and stood a while in the small stone room where Clara had died, where the gown and the chair still rested, untouched, and they were quiet there, and they remembered. And they laid a single white rose from the garden on the cold floor, and then they climbed back up into the light. It was on one of those yearly visits, several years after their marriage, that they made the last small discovery of the whole long story, the final gentle gift the house had been keeping for them. Eleanor, kneeling to lay the rose, noticed for the first time a place on the chamber wall, low down, in the corner, where the rock had been scratched, and looking closer by the lamplight she saw that it was not the desperate clawing of the bricked-up doorway, but something else, something patient and deliberate, made over many hours by a girl who had known she had many hours and nothing else to fill them with. Clara had carved into the stone letters, words, scratched painstakingly with some pin or buckle into the living rock, and Eleanor brought the lamp close and read them, the very last words of Clara Hartwood, written not in ink on a page to be found, but in stone, for herself, in the dark, in her final days. And they were not words of fear or despair at all. They were a poem, or the beginning of one, a few lines a girl had made to keep herself company at the end, and they spoke of the water, and of light remembered, and of a boy waiting in a lane, and they ended, where the carving stopped, where her strength must finally have failed her, with 3 words only, the last she ever wrote, scratched faint and small into the rock. I regret nothing. Eleanor knelt a long time before those words in the lamplight, and Adrian knelt beside her, and neither of them spoke, for there was nothing to say in the face of such a thing, a girl of 19 sealed in the dark 60 years before, carving into stone with her dying strength, not a curse, not a plea, not a cry against the cruelty of her fate, but only this, that she regretted nothing, that she would do it all again, the loving and the daring and the running toward the light, even knowing where it led. And Eleanor understood, kneeling there, that this was the true inheritance of Hartwood, the thing that had been waiting beneath its floors all along, deeper than the deeds and the entail and the great house itself. Not a fortune, not even a truth, though it was that too, but a kind of courage, the courage to love in spite of everything, to reach for the light even when the dark is certain, to regret nothing, ever, of having loved at all. It was the lesson Clara had carved into the stone with her last strength. It was the lesson Margaret had spent 60 faithful years learning and refusing to give up. And it was the lesson Eleanor herself had been brought to that high, lonely place to learn. She who had come to Heartwood broken and weary and small, certain that love was only a thing the world gave you in order to take it away again, and who had found instead, in a house full of ghosts, in the arms of a grave grey man as broken as herself, the courage to want, and to risk, and to regret nothing. The years went on, as years do, and they were good years, the best of Eleanor's life, and if they were quiet years, lived far from the noise of the world in a remote house among the hills, she found she did not miss the world at all, for she had everything in that high green place that a heart could want. The gardens came back, slowly, season by season, under her patient hands. The first spring she had cleared only the terrace nearest the house and planted it with the roses she had brought as cuttings from the wild old bushes by the chapel, Clara's roses she called them, and they took and bloomed, white and abundant, all along the front of the house. The second year she opened the rose walk, finding the old standards still alive beneath the brambles. Ancient and gnarled but living, and she pruned them back and fed the soil and coaxed them into flower again, so that by midsummer a person could walk the whole length of the old terrace beneath an arch of roses, the way the sisters must once have walked, 60 years before, in their long pale dresses, laughing, the third year she tackled the fountain, and Adrian, who could mend anything, traced the old lead pipes back to the very spring that fed the underground stream, the same water that ran through Clara's chamber far below, and he set it flowing again, so that the dry stone basin at the heart of the garden filled at last with clear cold water and the soft sound of it falling, and it seemed to Eleanor a kind of blessing. That the same water which had been the only companion of a girl's lonely death now rose up into the sunlight and the open air and sang in a fountain at the heart of a living garden. Year by year the garden spread, until the wild green chaos that had greeted her on the day she came was gone entirely, replaced by something ordered and beautiful and alive, not a grand garden, not a showpiece, but a working, breathing, much-loved garden, full of flowers for cutting and herbs for the kitchen and quiet corners for sitting. And it became known, in time, in the valley and even beyond, that the gardens of Heartwood had been brought back to life, and people began to ask whether they might see them. And so the house, which had stood shut and dark and forbidding for 60 years, a place of which the valley folk had spoken in lowered voices, opened its gates. Not as a grand attraction, nothing so formal as that, but once a year, on a Sunday in high summer, Eleanor and Adrian threw open the gardens of Heartwood to anyone who cared to come, and the whole valley came up the hill, the way they had come for Clara's funeral and for the wedding, but in their summer best, now, with children and picnic baskets. And they walked the rose terrace and sat by the singing fountain and spread their blankets on the lawns that ran down toward the lake. And there was tea, and there was cake, and there was music. And the old farmer, Thomas Ashby, growing very old now but still bright-eyed, sat in a chair in the shade and watched it all with a contentment that needed no words. The great house full of life and laughter. The gardens full of flowers, the long sad story of his family and the family on the hill, brought round at last to this, a summer afternoon, children running on the grass where two sisters had once laughed in a photograph. The Ashbys and the Heartwoods, the two families that grief had bound together 60 years before, became in those years something very near to one family in truth. Eleanor and Adrian had no other kin to speak of, and the old farmer's people, his children and grandchildren, filled that empty space gladly, and there was always an Ashby up at the hall, helping with the heavy work of the gardens, or down in the kitchen of an evening, and little Clara grew up with Ashby children for her playmates. Running wild with them through the woods and along the shore of the lake, and it seemed to Eleanor that this, more than anything, was the final undoing of the old sorrow, that the gardener's son and the daughter of the hall, kept apart in life by a father's cold pride, had become at last, across 3 generations and 60 years, one people, their descendants and inheritors grown up together as kin, the way it should always have been, the way it would have been if only a latch had not fallen in the dark one autumn night long ago. And sometimes on those golden summer afternoons, with the gardens full of people and the fountains singing and her own daughter laughing somewhere among the roses, Eleanor would slip away alone for a few minutes and climb the hill behind the chapel to the family plot and stand a while before the 2 graves there side by side, Margaret and Clara, the sister who searched and the sister who was lost, together now beneath the ancient yew, and she would not say anything, mostly, for she was not a woman much given to talking to the dead. But she would stand there in the warm wind with the sounds of the summer party drifting up faint from below, and she would feel, in some way she could not have explained, and did not try to, that they knew. That Margaret knew her long faithful search had not been in vain, that the truth had come up into the light at last, that her sister was free of the dark and resting in the warm earth beside her, that Clara knew the boy who had waited for her in the lane had been told, finally, that she was coming, that she had never changed her mind, and that his people and hers were one family now, their children playing together in the gardens below, and that both of them, the lost sister and the faithful one, knew that the house they had loved was loved again, lived in again, full of light and music and a child's laughter, saved from the dark and from the fire and from the grasping hands that would have torn it down, and would go on now, for generations yet unborn, descending always, as the old entail required, to those who would keep it whole. Eleanor would stand a while longer in the wind, and then she would turn and go back down the hill to her husband and her daughter and her guests, to her life, the life she had never expected, the life that had been waiting for her all along at the end of a long gravel drive beneath an avenue of lime trees, in a house that had held its breath for 19 years until she came. She thought often, in those years, of the woman she had been on the day the letter arrived, the wary, diminished woman in the little flower shop above the bakery, who had stood listening to the rain with a wax-sealed envelope pressed against her chest, certain that her quiet life was about to end. And it had ended. That woman had been right about that, if about nothing else. Her quiet, narrow, careful life had ended on the day that letter came, and a larger life had begun, a life with grief in it, and danger in it, and ghosts in it, but also love, more love than she had known the world contained, and a place to belong, and work worth doing, and a name worth carrying. She had inherited a house, and a truth, and a courage carved into stone in the dark, and she had spent the rest of her days proving worthy of all 3. And if you should ever, in your own travels, find yourself driving north through the green folded hills, far from the towns, where the forest presses close to the road and old iron gates mark the entrances to estates half forgotten, and if you should come upon a fallen sign half buried in nettles, and 2 weathered gateposts topped with stone hawthorn finials gone green with moss, and a long drive of pale gravel curving away beneath an avenue of ancient lime trees whose branches meet overhead to form a tunnel of dim and trembling light. Then turn in and follow the drive to its end, and you will find there a great grey house above a lake. Its windows lit, its gardens full of roses, smoke rising from its chimneys, the sound of a piano drifting from somewhere within, and the soft song of water falling in a fountain at the heart of the garden. And if it is a Sunday in high summer, you may even find the gates thrown open, and a welcome waiting, and an old woman with a quiet face and watchful eyes moving among the flowers she has tended for half a lifetime. And if you should ask her, she will tell you the whole long story of the letter and the wax seal, of the knocking in the dark and the wall behind which a girl had lain for 60 years, of the steward with the grave grey eyes who had decided never to feel anything again, and of how a house full of the dead taught two broken people how, at last, to live. She will tell you it began with a death and an inheritance. And she will tell you, if you stay to listen to the end, that it was the truest gift she was ever given. The whole of it, the grief and the love and the long hard work of healing, and that she would not change a single moment of it, not one. Not for anything in all the wide and waiting world. She regrets nothing. The water taught her that. The water which cannot be made to lie, and never did. Of all the seasons of that first year, it was the deep of the snowbound winter that Eleanor remembered most tenderly in the years that came after, the long white weeks before the fire and the wedding and the child, when it was only the two of them in the heart of the great house, learning each other slowly in the firelight. There was a night, she remembered, near midwinter, when the snow had fallen all day and into the dark, and the world beyond the windows was a hush of white, and they had made a small celebration of it, the two of them, because Adrian had said that Margaret had always kept the midwinter feast in the old way, with greenery brought in from the woods and candles in every window, and that it seemed wrong to let the custom die now that the house was living again. So they had gone out together into the snowy woods in the short grey afternoon and cut holly and ivy and pine, their breath smoking, the dogs bounding ahead through the drifts. And they had brought it all back to the house and dressed the great hall with it, twining the green branches along the banister of the stair and over the mantelpieces and around the frames of the watching portraits, and they had set candles in all the tall windows of the front of the house, dozens of them, so that anyone in the valley below who chanced to look up at the dark hill that night would have seen Heartwood blazing with light, every window gold, the way it must have blazed in the old days, in the time of the sisters, before the long dark came down. And then they had sat together before the great fire in the hall, beneath the green-dressed portraits, with the candlelight trembling in every window and the snow falling soft and endless beyond the glass. And they had been quiet together, and content, and Eleanor had felt, sitting there with her head on Adrian's shoulder and his arm around her, a peace so complete and so unfamiliar that it had frightened her a little, the way great happiness frightens those who have learned to expect it to be taken away. She had said as much to him, haltingly, for she was still learning then how to speak her heart to him, still half expecting, out of the long habit of her ruined marriage, to be mocked or dismissed for it. And Adrian had not mocked her. He had been quiet a while, and then he had said, in his low grave voice, that he understood it exactly, that he had felt the same fear himself, that for 11 years he had not allowed himself a single hour of happiness, because he had been so certain that to be happy was only to give the world another thing to take from him. And then he had turned to her in the firelight and taken her face in his hands, the way she had taken his on the night they first kissed, And he had said, "But I have been thinking, Eleanor, this whole long winter, about that girl down in the dark, about what she carved into the stone with the last of her strength. I regret nothing." He had said the words softly into the firelit hush. She had every reason in the world to be bitter, that girl, to curse the love that led her into the dark. And instead, at the very end, alone, dying, she carved into stone that she regretted nothing, that she would do it all again. And I have thought this winter that if she could find that courage there, in that place, with no hope left at all, then surely you and I, who have so much hope, who have each other and this house and our whole lives still before us, surely we can find it too. The courage to be happy. The courage to stop waiting for it to be taken away, and simply to have it, while we have it, and to be glad. Eleanor had wept then, quietly, in the candlelight, not from sorrow, but from the great overflowing fullness of her heart. And Adrian had held her, and outside the snow had gone on falling, soft and endless, burying the woods and the gardens and the graves on the hill in a deep and gentle white. And the candles had burned in all the windows of Heartwood far into the long midwinter night, a beacon on the dark hill, a sign to the whole sleeping valley that the old house was awake again, and warm, and loved, and that the long dark which had held it for 60 years was over now, and would not come again. And it was that night, Eleanor always thought afterward, more than the night of their first kiss, or the night of the fire, or even the day of their wedding, that she had truly given herself wholly into this new life, had truly let go of the small, wary, frightened woman she had been, and become instead the woman she was meant to be, the keeper of Heartwood, the wife of Adrian Hale, the mother of the child not yet born, the woman who had followed the water down into the dark and brought a truth up into the light, and learned, from a girl dead 60 years and an old woman dead only months, the hardest and most necessary lesson that a wounded heart can learn, which is simply this, that love is always worth the risk of losing it, that the dark is never the end of the story, and that those who have the courage to follow the water down, all the way down, into whatever frightening place it leads, will find there, more often than the fearful ever dare to hope, not death at all, but the beginning of a truer life. The candles burned low, the fire settled to embers, and in the great green dressed hall of the old house, beneath the portraits of all the Heartwoods who had loved and lost and searched and waited in that high, lonely place, two people who had each thought their hearts long dead sat together in the warm and growing certainty that they had been wrong, and were glad, beyond all words, to have been wrong, and that the rest of their lives, however long or short, would be lived not in the careful, narrow safety of those who have given up on joy, but wide open, unafraid, regretting nothing, in the full and certain knowledge that they had been, against all the odds and all the dark, most wonderfully and most unexpectedly found. The old farmer, Thomas Ashby, lived to see all of this, which was a mercy, for he had wanted it more than anyone. The joining of the two families, the house brought back to life, the long sorrow healed. He lived to dandle little Clara on his knee and tell her, in his cracked old voice, the story of her name, of the great-great-aunt 60 years dead, who had loved a gardener's son, and he lived to see the gardens bloom, and the gates thrown open, and the valley come up the hill on summer Sundays, and he died at last, very old, very peaceful, in his sleep. In the low farmhouse where his grandfather had grieved, and they buried him in the churchyard down in the valley, with half the county come to see him off, for he had been much loved. But Eleanor and Adrian asked, and his family agreed, that a place be kept for a small memorial to him up on the hill behind the chapel, near the two sisters, a simple stone among the heartwood graves, so that the gardener's grandson might lie at last, in spirit if not in body, among the family his grandfather had loved and lost and been kept from all his life, and so the old wound was closed, even in the ground, even among the dead, the Ashbys and the Heartwoods together on the hill at last, beneath the ancient yew, with the lake below and the wind in the grass, and the great house standing watch over them all. Little Clara grew. She grew tall and bright and unafraid, the way her namesake had been, and she loved the house and the gardens and the lake and the woods with her whole heart. And when she was old enough, her mother told her the whole of the story, all of it, the letter and the wax seal and the knocking in the dark, the wall and the grave and the carved stone, and took her down at last, hand in hand, into the lower chamber, to see the place where the first Clara had died, and to read the words she had carved. And the girl had stood before them a long time in the lamplight, the way her mother had, and had not been frightened, only moved. And afterwards she had said, in the way of children who go straight to the heart of things, she was brave, wasn't she? The first Clara. She was so brave. And Eleanor had said, yes, she was the bravest of all of us, and it is from her that we have everything. They never told the story for sorrow's sake in that house. That was the thing Eleanor was most careful of in all the years of raising her daughter beneath that roof. The story of Heartwood was a sad one, in its bones. A story of love forbidden and a girl lost in the dark and a sister grown old alone in faithful grief. But it was not, in the end, a sad story, and Eleanor would not let it be told as one, for it had not ended in the dark. It had ended in the light. It had ended in an open grave on a green hill, and a truth set free, and two families made one, and a house full of music, and a child running through the roses, and a fountain singing the song of the very water that had once been the only companion of a lonely death. It had ended, that long, sad story, in joy, the hard-won joy that comes only to those who have passed all the way through the dark and out the other side, and that is the only kind of joy, Eleanor had come to believe, that is truly worth the having. And so when she was an old woman herself, many years on, with Adrian Gray beside her and grey-haired children of her own grown, and gone out into the world and come back again with children of their own, Eleanor Hale would sit on summer evenings on the rose terrace of Heartwood in the soft gold light of the day's end and listen to the fountain singing and the laughter of her grandchildren on the lawns below, and she would think of the woman she had been on the day the letter came, and she would marvel, as she had marvelled all her life, at the strange long road that had brought her here, from a little flower shop above a bakery to this house, this garden, this life so full, it sometimes seemed it must overflow. She would think of Margaret, who had spent 60 years in faithful searching, so that she, Eleanor, might one day come and finish it. She would think of Clara, carving courage into stone in the dark. She would think of the gardener's son waiting in the lane, and the old farmer dandling a child on his knee, and the grave grey man who had watched her from a gallery window and decided, against all his long resolve, to feel something again. And she would think of the water, always the water, running still in the dark beneath the house, patient and clear and incapable of lying, the thread that ran through the whole of it, from the first night of knocking to the singing of the fountain at the heart of the garden, the water that had kept the truth safe through 60 years of silence, and had given it up at last to the one who came to. Listen. Follow the water down, the old woman had written, and Eleanor had followed it, all the way down, into the dark, into the grief, into the heart of the long sad story, and it had led her not to death, but to life, to love, to a home, to a name, to the whole of the rest of her days. The light would fade over the lake. The first stars would come out above the dark line of the woods, and somewhere within the house a lamp would be lit, and then another, the windows of Heartwood glowing one by one against the gathering dark, the way they had glowed on that first midwinter night, the way they would go on glowing. Eleanor knew, long after she herself was gone, for she had taught her children, and they would teach theirs, the thing she had learned in that house, the thing carved into the stone below and written in the notebooks above, and proved in her own healed and grateful heart, the simplest and the hardest truth there is, that love is worth the risk of it, that the dark is never the end, and that those who have the courage to follow the water all the way down will find, more often than the fearful ever dare to dream. Not the cold and the silence they feared, but a door, and beyond the door a light, and beyond the light a whole new life, waiting, as Heartwood itself had waited, patient through all the long years, for someone at last with the courage to come home.